Thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be able to speak to you all about free college and some ideas about higher education in general. So I'm going to take kind of a broader look at this issue rather than focusing on necessarily what's happening in New York State. I'd like to touch on the broader national dialogue about higher education. And in order to do that, I think the best way is to really take a look at what's happening in the market for higher education more broadly outside of any specific policy proposal. But to frame the remarks I have today, I want to use a trick that I stole from a friend in the policy world, actually. Whenever we talk about some sort of policy intervention or some sort of change, we tend to get excited about the ideas and sometimes forget to step back and think, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve here? And doing that and then comparing what the policy or the intervention actually has the ability to do sometimes leads us to different conclusions about the policy than we might have had initially. So in the case of higher education, and specifically when we're talking about the intervention of free college tuition, whether it be in a state model or in a federal model, as was discussed particularly during the presidential campaign, I want to do exactly that, which is to step back and say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? So it may seem obvious, and hopefully it doesn't seem sort of patronizing to think of it this way, but again, I think it's helpful. So if you listen to the language that politicians often use when they're talking about higher education and the intervention of free college, it's the first explanation for the need for this sort of intervention is that college is unaffordable. So this is rhetoric that we hear often and maybe just something that we assume to be true at this point. But I want to offer just some alternatives that I think could prompt you to think about college affordability in a different light. So when pressed a little bit further to talk about college affordability and the unaffordability in the status quo, people will often talk about the inability of parents to finance their children being able to go to college strictly out of the savings in their bank account or what they earn in the years that their children are enrolled in college. And that's a fine definition of affordability. But I'll offer that there is another definition of affordability and a definition that I think might actually be better for policy purposes. Number one, when we think about affordability and define it as an intergenerational notion, that is, what can parents afford for their children, we're neglecting to acknowledge the fact that the traditional student of today is no longer what we think of as their traditional student. So students are not necessarily coming out of their parents' home, from being financially dependent on their parents, then going directly to college and experiencing an in-residence kind of traditional experience that we tend to think of. Students today are more often independent. They are not relying on the support of others in their immediate family to pay their tuition bill. And so we need to think of a definition for affordability that works for them. Because thinking about whether or not parents have enough cash to pay the bill for their children leaves them out of the conversation. And these are probably among the most disadvantaged students in our system today. The other way of thinking about college affordability is a notion of worth. So I'll suggest that as an economist, I like to think about higher education as an investment that pays off over the course of a lifetime. And so an alternative way of thinking about affordability, one that works universally, not just for those who have a traditional family and the intergenerational transfer of wealth happening, is this idea of, in the long run, is the price worth what I'm going to get in terms of future employment outcomes through consistency of employment, but also through higher wages? So we kind of sum those things up and think of that as being the rate of return on a degree. And I think that rate of return is actually a more effective way of thinking about college affordability in a policy context for the reasons that I talked about. So is college universally affordable, meaning can everyone go to any college they'd like with the cash that they have on hand? Absolutely not. I would never argue that to be true. But what I would argue to be true is that very generally college is worth it. So some of the best estimates on the rate of return for a bachelor's and associate's degree come out of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and they estimate that the rate of return for either of those degrees is about 15%. So if you think of anywhere else you could be investing your dollars, you'd be pretty lucky to get that sort of return. So in that sense, college is a good deal. Not everybody gets that rate of return, of course. But when we think generally about the notion of affordability, we have to recognize there are a lot of people who are getting a great deal when they go to college. The benefits are far outweighing the upfront cost, and there are challenges to making that upfront cost, but it's important to recognize that notion as a starting point. So if this is the case, why is it that free college is not necessarily the solution? So if college is not just universally unaffordable, but rather there are individuals and segments of the college-going population for whom it's unaffordable, why is free college not the answer? So EJ touched on this in his remarks. The benefits of these free college proposals are largely going to be delivered to the more well-off students, which are the students who need the help the least in the system. So when we look at for who is college unaffordable, it's these people who are independent students, the people coming from the lowest income households, and these are the people who would receive the smallest boost, if any boost, from general free college proposals and this New York State free college proposal in particular. So that's the first one. So is college unaffordable? Not in the universal sense. And so in that way, free college is really not the answer to the unaffordability problems that do exist in the system. So second, I want to talk about something that I've written a lot about, and that's debt. So part of the rhetoric around free college also comes from the crushing student loan burden as a driver. So people will argue that young people are being crushed in their personal and financial lives because of the student debt that they carry. And at a macro level, we have implications for the economy because of the fact that so many young people are carrying debt today. So in reality, student debt is crushing some people. But I'll also argue that debt is in fact helping to grow our economy. To take that second point first, so if we step back again, to that 15% rate of return that's estimated to be what people are getting in exchange for the upfront price they're paying for college. If we were thinking of folks investing in a business and getting a 15% rate of return but using debt to do that, we think that's great for the economy. But when we think of people investing in themselves, borrowing to do so and getting a 15% rate of return, we suddenly become very concerned about the macroeconomic implications, and I think that's misguided. Another way we make a mistake in thinking about the economic implications of debt is when we talk about spending, consumer spending. That's a big indicator of the economy. MSNBC gets all excited when the new numbers come out in consumer spending because it's a big indication of what people think is going to happen in the economy. When people spend more on consumption, we generally think that's a positive for the economy. When people spend more on education, we tend to think there's some sort of black hole that exists in the education market, and those dollars somehow get kicked out of the economy. It's not the case. So institutions are businesses. They don't like to be called that, but they are. They're institutions that operate in our economy, and they contribute to our economy. So I think it's misguided to think of the increased spending that we have seen as necessarily being negative for the macroeconomy. So stepping back again, so many of you have seen either this figure or heard rhetoric that matches this figure, which is essentially to say that debt has increased at a pretty rapid clip over the past 2 decades, or several decades. This is just the past 2 decades in this picture. This is mean and median debt increasing over that period of time. We don't even need this picture because we've heard over and over and over in the media stories about student debt that we've had this rapid increase in debt being driven by a rapid increase in price. We all know that tuition has grown at a pace that's faster than the price of or inflation in any other segment of the economy, including healthcare, which is a pretty startling statistic. But I will say there is some misinformation about what is going on with borrowing in the economy. So in 2000, let's see, was it 13 or 14, there was a study of 100 recent newspaper articles about student loan debt. And when they pulled through all these articles and they calculated what was the average debt that these people had, these are the people who were being interviewed by the reporters for the stories about student debt, they saw that the average student in these stories had $85,000 in student loan debt. And so given that, it's not surprising that people are very startled and concerned about what is happening with student lending and its potential implications. But the reality is that's more than 3 times what a typical student with a bachelor's degree will borrow over the course of their degree. So the very large balances that we hear an awful lot about are actually exceedingly rare. So this is to say, again, if the problem we're concerned about is this universal notion of crushing student debt, we may be misguided to think of free college as the solution. It's also true that the people who have the largest debts are doing quite well financially. So the highest rates of defaults we're seeing among people who have very small student loan balances. Statistically, it's less than $5,000 is the bin of folks who are doing the worst. So wiping away those very large student loan burdens with a free college type policy is really not going to get to the root of that problem either. Let's see. This is just to illustrate what is actually the distribution of debt looking like right now. And so you can see for a typical bachelor's degree student, the amount of debt is going to be around $30,000. Anything more than $60,000 for someone with a bachelor's degree is really largely unheard of. The balances of over $50,000 are also quite rare. They only come up about 7% of the time when we look at young people specifically. So if that's the case, and let's suppose I've convinced you that neither of those problems are an actual driver that would rationalize a free college proposal, what is a problem that's worthy of solving in higher education? And I'll say very specifically, it's that college is not the driver of social mobility that we would like it to be. So college works quite well for people from the upper income portions of the economy. It works less well for people who are more disadvantaged. People from disadvantaged households enroll in college at lower rates, and they also graduate at lower rates. Even when they get the same degree as people from wealthier households, the economic return for them is less. So free college proposals, which tend to give the greatest bump to the highest income students, at least if underneath an income cap, if there happens to be one like there is in the New York State proposal, this does nothing for the people who are the neediest when it comes to this specific problem of college just not working quite as well as it should for boosting people out of these lowest points of the income distribution. Just to illustrate what's happening, and I think EJ did this pretty well with his picture, but to put some numbers behind it. If you look at a student who's attending SUNY Albany, for instance, suppose their family has less than $30,000 in income. This student's already going to SUNY free of tuition charge. So a free tuition proposal on top of the status quo would not benefit them in any way. In contrast, a student comes from a family with household income between $75,000 and $100,000. They're getting very little support, less than $7,000 from grant aid. So they're going to be approaching about a $6,000 benefit in tuition. And so you might say, that's great. This policy is helping people. Maybe it's not solving all of the problems, but these lower income people are already going to college for free. Something that's forgotten a lot is that the total cost of going to college is not just tuition alone. So the alternative to putting more subsidies into students who are coming from these upper income households is to deliver more support to students from the lower levels of the income distribution. And so just to conclude, and this is sort of an obvious point, free college is not really free. It's simply an alternative system for paying for the same thing. So we are currently in a place where the people who benefit economically from a degree are the one who are paying the price. That's just the way that markets match things up. You pay the price, you get the benefit, and that's because we don't have a socialized system of education. If we were to switch to more of a free college type regime, then we would have more people collectively paying for the cost of enrollment for people who ultimately benefit from those degrees. The concerning thing there is that we may have people who are not benefiting economically at all from college. They may not even be touching the higher education world, and yet they're supporting through their tax dollars, making college less expensive for many people who could already afford it otherwise. So those are my concerns with the proposal, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel's remarks and having a hearty conversation with you all after.